Greetings, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. We welcome you. I'm so happy you're here. I think we'll get started now. I'm Carrie Hessler-Radlett, the president of Global Communities. On behalf of Global Communities, our partners and funders, I welcome you all here today to participate in the presentation and discussion of our effects study results. The study was conducted in the Mara region of Tanzania between December 2018 and January 21st, 2021, and was known as Malezi Bora, or Good Upbringing in Kiswahili. Global Communities received funding from the Eleanor J. Cook Foundation and the Conrad N. Hilton Foundation to implement a randomized control trial that measured benefits of father engagement and bundling of nutrition and parenting interventions on child diets, child development, parents' care practices, and gender equality. We brought together an extensive and impressive research team with complementary skills and expertise to help us implement the study. Purdue University provided expertise in nutrition and overall oversight of data collection. Harvard University provided expertise in parenting and early child development. The Africa Academy for Public Health, our local research partner, hired and trained data collectors and conducted the 3 rounds of data collection at baseline, midline, and endline. The Tanzania government's National Institute for Medical Research provided technical oversight of the implementation of the research protocols on the ground. And Global Communities provided overall coordination and oversight of all aspects of the study and designed and implemented the interventions and the process evaluation. All partners participated in the study design and evaluation tool development, while the data were analyzed by colleagues at Purdue and Harvard. The study required a wide range of expertise and skills from each of the partners. Global Communities oversaw funding and implementation of all activities. Mary Pat Kiefer was the overall principal investigator, and Lauren Galvin was the overall project manager and gender lead. Lauren also developed the 4 intervention packages, and Alfreda Kumalija managed a stellar intervention team on the ground in Mara region. Dr. George Pregod was our co-principal investigator from the Tanzania National Institute of Medical Research. From Purdue, we had Dr. Nilupa Gunaratna and Dr. Ramya Ambikapati, who provided leadership on all aspects of nutrition, especially the evaluation tools, data management, and analysis. From Harvard, we had Dr. Aisha Yousafzai and Dr. Joshua Juang, who provided leadership on all aspects of early child development, or ECD, and parenting, including intervention development, evaluation tools, and data analysis. And from the African Academy of Public Health, we had Dr. Mary Mwanyika Sando and Dr. Dominique Mosha, who assured the highest quality of data collection rigor on the ground. We deeply appreciate the contributions of each of these team members and many others not acknowledged here. I will now ask Mary Mwanyika Sando, our co-principal investigator from the Africa Academy for Public Health, to lead the overview of the study.
Hello. Mary Sando has had some technical difficulties, unfortunately, and we're trying to get her back. In the meantime, I'm Mary Pat Kiefer, and I will go through her slides. We'll begin with the rationale and the background for the study. Parenting and nutrition programs are usually separate, though they share many risk factors, and both are critical to the holistic development of a child. Secondly, most nutrition programs are only directed towards women. Yet fathers have significant decision-making power in the household and influence what and how much a child might eat. Global Communities implemented the study in the Mara region of Tanzania, where it had strong relationships already with communities and local government. In this region, there is high acceptance of patriarchal norms. Stunting is about 26 to 28%, and child developmental delays affect approximately 20% of the children. With these, the study was designed to answer two primary research questions. Will engaging fathers, in addition to mothers, improve child nutrition and development more so than engaging only mothers? And secondly, will bundling nutrition and parenting interventions improve child nutrition and development more so than a nutrition intervention without parenting? This is the study design, and I'll walk you through it. Effects was a cluster randomized controlled trial with 5 study arms, 4 of which were intervention arms. First, engaging mothers in a nutrition intervention. Second, engaging mothers in a bundled nutrition and parenting intervention. Third, engaging mothers and fathers in nutrition intervention. And fourth, engaging mothers and fathers in the bundling and parenting intervention. We randomly selected 80 village in Butiama and Musoma rural districts in our region. With involvement of the district and the village leaders, each village was randomly assigned to one of the 5 study arms. Then global communities visited households in each according to a randomized list until we identified 12 qualifying households that consented to participate. Household inclusion criteria included having an index child 0 to 18 months of age, mothers and fathers living together at least 10 months of the year, households remaining in the study area, and both parents providing informed consent. Ethical approvals were obtained from the National Institute of Medical Research in Tanzania, Harvard School of Public Health, Purdue Universities, and global communities. Our primary outcomes were child dietary diversity and child development, and these 2 outcomes powered our study. The measurement of dietary diversity is how many of these 8 food groups were eaten over the last 24 hours, and we list the groups here. And for child development, we measured cognitive, language, and motor development using the standardized Bayley scales. For data collection, the AAPH recruited and trained data collectors who were separate from the implementation team. We collected data from mothers, fathers, and the index child in each of 960 enrolled households at baseline, midline, and endline. In the households, mothers and fathers were interviewed separately in a private location. The child anthropometry and development assessments were conducted by trained assessors in a central location in the community. At each data collection time point, some households were unreachable for various reasons. This resulted in final data on 85% of the mothers, 76% of the fathers, and 87% of children at endline. Fathers were more often away from home compared to mothers, which accounts for that. I'll now go into the intervention. And I'm going to begin with the theory of change, which is the basis for the intervention. And I'll walk you through this. On the left, the mother and father peer group intervention is in the 2 yellow boxes. And the red circle on the right indicates the primary outcomes, which we've already said. We have 2 main pathways that lead to these outcomes. The green nutrition pathway begins in the upper left-hand corner, and it includes items related to poor food access, child illness, and then moves to feeding and hygiene behaviors. The purple parenting pathway starts at the center bottom and focuses on responsive caregiving and child play and communication. And because we have couples in the study, we included a gender equality and psychosocial pathway in the blue boxes at the bottom left. This is a pathway that could moderate or enhance the other 2 main pathways. This includes mental health, the quality of the couple's relationship, and women's decision-making power. All the lines that you see trace the pathways, and you can see the overlap that many of the behaviors have that lead to the nutrition and child development outcomes. Based on the theory of change, we identified a group of secondary outcomes. For nutrition, this included child growth and morbidity, infant and young child feeding knowledge and practice, water sanitation and hygiene knowledge and practice, budgeting and purchasing decisions, and agricultural practices. For parenting, we included stimulation, responsiveness, a variety of learning materials, disciplinary practices, co-parenting, and stress and depressive symptoms. And for gender equality and women's empowerment, we looked at gender attitudes, the couple's relationship quality and communication, time use, women's decision-making power, intimate partner violence, and maternal dietary diversity. With the theory of change in mind, we conducted extensive formative research in Mara region to ensure that our interventions were targeted and relevant to the local communities in Mara. So here you can see all 4 intervention arms, and each of them included an enhanced nutrition curriculum. This curriculum consisted of sessions on infant and young child feeding, food access, baby wash, managing stress, and couples communication. In the study arms with fathers, there was additional content for the father groups. This content focused on challenging harmful gender norms and roles and defining fatherhood and healthy relationships. In the study arm for the 2 bundled arms, the intervention packages added sessions on responsive caregiving, including responsive feeding, play and communication, and positive discipline. I just want to note that in order to have similar times across all arms, some of the nutrition and wash content had to be shortened in the bundled arms. The intervention itself was peer group sessions led by community health workers already present in the study villages. In the couples study arms, the mothers groups were led by female CHWs and the fathers group by a male CHW where possible. There were 24 peer group sessions over a 12-month period, and each group had 12 participants. Because of COVID, we paused our intervention at 9 months, and we had to pivot to home visits for the last 3 months. The behavior change approach focused on discussion, problem solving, coaching, skills building, and scaffolding and commitment setting. Each intervention package consisted of a training guide, facilitator's manual, and a flip chart to use during the groups, a storybook, a recipe book, and a play and communication guide for the bundled arms. CHWs were trained using skill-based and coaching-oriented methodologies with refreshers every quarter. We had a dedicated project manager and 8 field supervisors who routinely observed sessions to document delivery quality and provided coaching and mentoring to the CHWs. Group attendance was 74% for moms and 70% for dads, with attendance increasing to 90% for moms and 86% for dads during home visits. I'll now hand over to my colleague, Nalupa Gunaratna, who will provide an overview of our data analysis approach and begin the presentation on our nutrition results. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Mary Pat. I'll start here. To achieve our primary aims, which were to evaluate father engagement and bundled nutrition and parenting content, we identified 4 research questions. So first, does any intervention improve an outcome beyond changes observed in the control? To answer this question, we compared the average change from baseline to end line in the 4 intervention arms in green to the change in the control arm in yellow. We'll refer to this research question as research question or RQ1. We also examined changes in each intervention arm compared to the control, which helped us to determine if any specific interventions were driving a significant change compared to the control. Our next question, RQ2, was whether engaging couples affects an outcome differently than engaging mothers alone. So here we compare the couples arms highlighted in green to arms that engage only mothers highlighted in yellow. This allows us to isolate and quantify the additional benefit of father engagement. Next, RQ3 addresses whether bundling nutrition and parenting content affects an outcome differently than providing nutrition content alone. Here we compare the arms that receive the bundled content in green to the arms that only receive nutrition content in yellow. And this allows us to quantify the additional benefit of bundling parenting with the nutrition content. Finally, it's possible that there may be a synergistic or interaction effect between our 2 interventions of father engagement and bundled content. We investigate this by first comparing the couple's nutrition arm to the mother's nutrition arm, which provides an estimate of the effect of father engagement when nutrition content is delivered. We then compare the couple's bundled content arm to the mother's bundled content arm, and that estimates the effect of father engagement when we deliver bundled content. RQ4 compares these 2 effects. If the effect of father engagement differs depending on which content is delivered, that indicates that there's an interaction effect between our 2 interventions. So now I'll start presenting our findings with child diets and growth. All our results are going to be presented similarly, so let me take a moment to describe this slide. Here are the findings for 24-hour child dietary diversity. In the graph, you see the number of food groups consumed by a child in a 24-hour period at baseline and at endline. And there are 5 lines indicating the 5 study arms. The control is in black. The red lines indicate nutrition content. The blue lines indicate bundled content. And then meanwhile, we have the dotted lines indicating engagement of both parents, while the solid lines indicate engagement of mothers alone. So what we see here is a natural increase in child dietary diversity as children age from baseline to endline. However, the increase was greatest when fathers were engaged and parents received bundled content. The table at the bottom summarizes the statistical results for the 4 research questions. For each research question, we have an estimate of the difference in differences and its accompanying 95% confidence interval and p-value. So for example, for RQ1, an estimate of 0.25 means that the increase in the 4 intervention arms was on average a quarter of a food group greater than the increase in the control arm. This change was not statistically significant, and neither were the changes for RQs 2 and 3. However, for RQ4, which examines whether the effects of father engagement differ depending on content, that was highly significant with a difference of 0.83 food groups per day. Children whose parents were both engaged and received bundled content had a significantly greater increase in one-day dietary diversity. We see a similar pattern in 7-day child dietary diversity. Here are the significant effects in the research questions. In the next slide. The significant effects here in the research questions are driven by the father engagement and bundling arm, which has a greater increase than the other arms. We examined child growth using anthropometry. The graph here represents length for age C-score in the 5 arms over time. So overall length for age fell over time, but no significant intervention effects were detected, which is reflected in the non-significant results for length for age in the table below. Not pictured, but also in the table, you'll see the results for weight for height C-score. There we found a greater reduction in weight for height among intervention arms compared to the control group, which is reflected in the results for RQ1. However, in further analysis, when we control for household, maternal, and paternal characteristics, child morbidity, and breastfeeding, this effect becomes non-significant. Overall, we do not believe that interventions affect child growth. Next, I'm going to talk about household behaviors related to infant and young child feeding, water, sanitation, and hygiene, and food access. So nutritious foods for the family can be obtained from local food markets or from one's own production. One of our promoted practices was budgeting for the purchase of healthy foods for children. The graph here shows the percentage of mothers who put aside money to purchase healthy foods for children at baseline and endline. What we see are low levels at baseline, which increased dramatically in all 4 intervention arms compared to the control. This led to a significant result for RQ1. Not pictured, but with a similar pattern and given in the table, we see that fathers were also more likely to purchase special foods for children in the market across the intervention arms compared to the control. Now, as I mentioned, another source of nutritious food is home production. We found an increase in the cultivation of new foods to improve the family's diet. The graph here presents the percentage of fathers who report growing new foods. There was a significant increase in fathers reporting this practice in the father engagement arms compared with arms where only mothers were engaged. When it comes to child feeding, we found increased involvement of fathers in food preparation. While this was not the majority of fathers who were engaged by our interventions were more likely to report contributing to preparing children's foods, and the increase was particularly notable when fathers were engaged and families received bundled content, which is shown in the blue dotted line. The intervention in any form also had a clear effect on households' consumption of clean water. Here we see the percentage of households reporting consumption of clean and safe water before and after the intervention. The households that received any intervention were more likely to consume clean water, and with a greater increase observed when households received the nutrition-only content compared to the bundled content. Now, given our theory of change, we considered several other related secondary outcomes, and just to summarize those, we found that engaging with a parent, whether the mother or the father, increases the parent's knowledge of IYCF and the number of critical times they washed their or their child's hands. Bundled content also led to a lower likelihood of reported symptoms of illness in children, likely driven by a lower incidence of cough. A number of secondary outcomes didn't have significant interaction effects. This included mothers and fathers report of fathers providing mothers with money to purchase healthy foods. There's also no intervention effects on inter-household allocation of animal source foods or for father's likelihood to sit with a child while eating. There were no further intervention effects on other aspects of WASH or child morbidity, for example, observations of feces in the household's compound or mother's report of recent fever or diarrhea in the child. Okay, I'll now hand it over to Dr. Aisha Yousafzai, who will present the findings on child development.
Thank you, Nilupa. Our results pertaining to children's development are going to be presented at the level of the child and at the level of the caregivers. As a brief reminder, we assess children's cognitive, language, and motor development using the Bayley scale for infant and toddler development. And this has been translated, culturally modified, and found to be both reliable and valid in a Tanzanian context. Next slide. Children's cognitive abilities encompasses their ability to solve problems, to reason, and early or pre-academic skills, such as being able to recognize colors. By the end of the effects trial, we saw that children of caregivers who were participating in the bundled interventions, shown in the upper blue lines, had significantly higher cognitive development scores than children in the interventions where only mothers were targeted, where only nutrition was targeted. Next slide, please. We see similar results for children's receptive language, that is, their capacity to understand words and the communication of efforts of those around them. Again, we see that children whose caregivers were participating in the bundled interventions had significantly higher scores at endline in regards to their receptive language than children whose caregivers were participating in the nutrition-only interventions. Next slide. In addition to the specific child development outcomes, we measured a broad array of parenting practices. Next slide. Maternal stimulation describes the number of play and communication activities that a mother is engaged with her young child that support development and learning. Here we see that these activities can include things like telling stories, singing songs. And here we see that children of caregivers participating in any intervention had greater maternal involvement in stimulation practices than the mothers in the control arm. Significantly, we also see that in the children of caregivers in the bundled interventions had significantly higher scores in terms of maternal stimulation than children of caregivers, than the maternal mothers in the nutrition-only intervention. Next slide, please. Similarly, we can also see these data with respect to fathers' involvement in stimulation practices. Again, we see that where fathers were engaged in any intervention, they were more likely and had higher stimulation practice scores than fathers in the control arm. Specifically here, we see that where fathers were targeted in terms of couples involvement, shown in the dashed red and blue lines in the upper part of the graph, we can see that they had significantly greater paternal stimulation practices than when only mothers were targeted, shown in the solid red and blue lines below. Next slide, please. A variety of home learning materials is important in order to stimulate and foster healthy development and learning. This can include access to low-cost toys, picture books, or everyday items found in the home, such as cups or blocks that children can use to explore, to stack, to play games with. Again, we see that children of caregivers who were participating in any intervention had significantly greater access to a variety of home learning materials than children whose caregivers were in the control arm. However, we can also see more closely that children whose caregivers were specifically targeted in the bundled intervention arms, shown in the upper blue lines, had significantly greater access to home learning materials than children whose caregivers were targeted for nutrition-only interventions. Next slide, please. Parenting distress can be an inhibitor to providing optimal nurturing care for young children's healthy development. And here we looked at fathers' parenting distress. We can see that in the couples intervention arm, shown in the bundled arms, compared with the nutrition arms, fathers had decreased distress. This means that they are likely to be able to have more emotional availability to provide nurturing care for their young child. Next slide, please. While these results are mixed, we also see other significant effects. Couples arms had less improvement in children's expressive language than mothers only. The bundled intervention arms also reduced the odds of maternal harsh discipline compared to when only nutrition was targeted. And there were some positive interaction effects on maternal responsive feeding. However, while there were some significant impacts, there were also non-significant effects. For example, there was no impact seen on children's motor development, either their fine or gross motor development. Neither did we see impacts that were significant related to caregiver interactions with their young children, both with regards to mothers and fathers, harsh disciplinary practices of fathers, mothers' distress and co-parenting measures, as well as maternal and paternal parenting knowledge and their depressive symptoms. Thank you. I'll now hand over to Lauren.
Thank you, Aisha. So I will now present on our household gender equality and women's empowerment results. So I want to start by sharing a theory of change that we developed specifically to describe how our interventions would advance gender equality and women's empowerment, which in turn will contribute to better child health and development outcomes. The first pathway circled here in green is our empowerment pathway. We hypothesized that all 4 interventions with mothers would increase maternal nutrition and parenting knowledge, skills, and self-efficacy, increase social support, and improve mental health. More empowered mothers would lead to better outcomes for themselves and their children. Our second pathway in blue describes our father engagement and gender equality pathway. Our theory here was that our interventions with fathers and couples would make fathers more responsive to the needs of their family. This would lead to strengthened intimate partner relationships and to greater household gender equality in terms of decision-making, division of labor, and bodily autonomy. We believe that couples in healthy relationships, free from violence, with shared control over household resources, will enable better outcomes for women and children. So to start, we measured gender attitudes, specifically the acceptance or rejection of patriarchal norms that legitimize men's superior status and perpetuate distinct and unequal roles for women and men. The tool was comprised of 12 statements related to household roles and responsibilities that respondents either agreed or disagreed with. What we found was that fathers who participated in either intervention, the nutrition or bundled nutrition and parenting, were more likely to agree with household gender equality compared to fathers who weren't engaged in the program. This suggests that our father engagement strategies were successful at shifting beliefs toward greater agreement with more gender equitable household relations and roles between couples. Let's now look at maternal gender attitudes. We used the same gender attitude scale for both mothers and fathers. Interestingly, we found that mothers in our study, both at baseline and endline, expressed less agreement with household gender equality compared to fathers. So in terms of intervention impacts, we found that mothers in the father engagement arms expressed greater agreement with household gender equality compared to mothers in the mothers-only arms. This suggests that women's attitudes are influenced by their spouses and that there may be intrinsic value to women in terms of challenging their own internalized beliefs about gender and power, of engaging men in programs that actively strive to transform household relations and roles between women and men. We also looked at how much time fathers spent in a day on domestic chores, such as fetching water, washing clothes, going to the market, cleaning and cooking, collecting firewood, and childcare. We found that fathers who participated in either intervention spent significantly more time on domestic chores compared to fathers not engaged, and by more than 1 additional hour per day. It's encouraging that our father engagement interventions not only influenced attitudes related to household gender roles, but practices as well. So we also measured how frequently couples communicated about key household topics, whether often, sometimes, rarely, or never, specifically about household income, productive assets, food purchases, and animal source food allocation. What we found was that across all intervention arms, we observed more frequent couples communication compared to the control arm. We observed the greatest positive impact on couples communication frequency in the couples bundled arm, with a change over time from 4 decisions out of 8 often discussed with one spouse at baseline to approximately 6.5 topics often discussed with one spouse at endline. In other words, father engagement was effective at increasing couples communication frequency when couples participated in bundled interventions, suggesting potentially broader benefits of parenting specific content to aspects of the couple's relationship. We also looked at mothers' overall decision-making power. We defined decision-making power as having either joint or autonomous authority over decisions related to household income, productive assets such as crop production and livestock, food purchases, and animal source food allocation. Our tool included a total of 8 decisions. At baseline, we found that maternal decision-making power was low, with women having decision-making power over 2 to 2.5 major household decisions out of 8. By endline, we observed that across all arms, maternal decision-making power increased, including among mothers in the control arm. However, mothers in the father engagement arms reported greater household decision-making power than mothers in the mothers-only arms. This highlights the important role that men can play in advancing women's greater access to household resources that are critical for nutrition. Gender-based violence is highly prevalent in Mara. At baseline, up to 70% of women had experienced at least one form of violence, physical, sexual, or emotional, perpetrated by their spouses within the past 3 months. We know that women's exposure to IPV has detrimental consequences to women's own health and well-being and that of her children. We wanted to measure IPV to monitor whether engaging fathers exacerbated women's risk of domestic violence. What we found instead was significant reductions in IPV among all intervention arms compared to the control, and the reduction was greatest in the bundled nutrition and parenting arms. So surprisingly, while engaging fathers had no effect on IPV reduction, parenting content did. It's possible the focus on responsive caregiving and positive discipline in the bundled packages had broader impacts on family violence. And lastly, we measured maternal dietary diversity as an indicator of women's nutritional status. Father engagement had significant positive impact on women's diets by nearly 0.3 food groups, compared to mothers in the mothers-only arms. However, father engagement had a greater impact on maternal diets by 0.75 food groups when couples participated in bundled interventions compared to nutrition-only interventions. So in the couples bundled arm, we observed an increase from 3.9 food groups at baseline to 5 food groups at endline. Our results suggest that to have the greatest impact on family diets, we should consider engaging fathers in programs that not only address food and feeding practices and gender norms, but also issues of responsive caregiving and the quality of the father-child relationship. So this last slide summarizes other significant effects. So we found that any intervention compared to the control increased couples' communication frequency over contraceptive use, improve couples' communication quality, and increase the likelihood of mothers feeling listened to by their spouses. And lastly, we observed a marginally significant reduction in maternal report of social support from peers among the couples arms compared to the mothers-only arms. and this is perhaps because the sessions with couples inhibited women's bonding with their female peers. So I will now turn it over to Mary Pat for a high-level summary of our results.
Thanks so much, Lauren, and thanks to all three of you for sharing those results. I want to bring everybody back now to a general summary of our findings, kind of a high-level summary so that we can understand the implication of these results. The most important thing that we saw in this study was positive effects across all three of the pathways of nutrition, parenting, and gender with these two interventions. We found that when engaging fathers, when we had bundled nutrition and parenting intervention, and for some outcomes, we saw the greatest positive effect when we did both. So for each of these show positive results in some aspects, but for each of the pathways. But I want to take us now to how we answer our 4 research questions. So research question 1 was any intervention versus the control arm. And here we see that engaging only mothers in nutrition programs showed some benefit for some outcomes over the control arm. And these outcomes included moms' IYCF and WASH knowledge and practices, moms putting money aside to buy nutritious foods, consumption of clean water, dads purchasing of special foods at the market for the child, and couples contraception-related communication frequency. For research question 2, father engagement was critical for achieving positive effects across many outcomes for women, children, and couples. These included child dietary quality, father's IYCF and WASH knowledge and practice, paternal agricultural practices, paternal stimulation practices, paternal time spent per day on domestic chores, maternal and paternal gender attitudes, women's decision-making power, and women's dietary quality. Research question 3 is about the benefits of bundling the nutrition and parenting interventions. And this had benefits for child development, for parenting, for nutrition, and for gender equality, more so than nutrition-only interventions. The addition of the parenting content had benefits in child cognitive and receptive language development, maternal stimulation, the variety of learning materials in the home, paternal parenting distress, maternal agricultural practices, and intimate partner violence, and the quality of women's diets. This interaction question is research question number 4. So we observed a positive interaction here for some of the outcomes where engaging fathers was effective or most effective when dads were also exposed to the bundled parenting content. These outcomes included maternal and child dietary diversity, maternal responsive feeding, father's food preparation practices for the child, and couples communication frequency. Finally, based on all of this, we'd like to leave you with some recommendations for both program and policy based on all the learning that we found through this study. First of all, for us, it's very clear that nutrition and parenting programs should be delivered together and to engage both parents where possible. The benefits of this cross all of these pathways, as you can see. Gender equality and women's empowerment are also critical elements of nutrition and parenting programs and have wide effects. With sufficient training and mentorship, community CHWs can effectively deliver a multi-input curriculum through groups and home visits, although the CHWs may need additional support to better engage fathers. And finally, additional research would let us know what the right balance is between the nutrition and parenting content so that we can maximize the effectiveness for both nutrition and early childhood development outcomes. And before I close, I really want to acknowledge some of the many individuals and institutions who contributed to this study. First of all, our funders, the Eleanor Cook Foundation, represented by Chaitanya Kampala, and the Conrad Hilton Foundation, represented by Lisa Bomer. They provided extensive support through not only financial, but other kinds of support through the implementation of this project. The government of Tanzania, who's very active in both of these technical areas of nutrition and child development, specifically the President's Office, the Regional Administration for Local Government, the Ministry of Health, the regional and district officials, and the village leaders in the Mara region. Frida Kumalija, who was our awesome project manager, and the effects team of field supervisors and M&E officers. And we want to make this presentation in memory of Hamad Omari, one of the field supervisors who passed away recently. At AAPH, Frank Mapendo and Isaac Liatu provided great support on the ground with the data collection and management. Elizabeth Macha, who supported curriculum development and training in Tanzania. All the 96 CHWs who led the peer groups, the 960 households who participated in the study, and finally, WHO, UNICEF, Promundo, EGPAF, and Save the Children for resources that help to inform our intervention packages. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Carrie for our panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mary Pat, and to all the presenters who have shared our study results and key takeaways. That was fantastic. Before we take questions on the presentation, we'd first like to invite a panel of global experts working in the field of nutrition, child development, and engaging men and boys for gender equality to share with us their perspective on the effects study in light of the broader trends and priorities across these three disciplines. On our panel today, we have Erin Milner, a senior advisor for nutrition monitoring, evaluation, and learning at USAID, Lynette Okengo, the executive director of the Africa Early Childhood Development Network, and Clara Aleman, director of programs at Promundo. So let's start with a question for Erin, our nutrition expert. Erin, in what ways does this study help advance the field of global nutrition in terms of father engagement and the bundling of nutrition and parenting interventions within one program?
Great, thanks for this question, and excuse me for the cold. So this study provides valuable additional evidence about the importance of father engagement in parenting interventions for nutrition as well as early childhood development. Many nutrition interventions often actually ultimately aim to improve child development through nurturing care, but we know from the nurturing care framework that nutrition is only one component of nurturing care. So these findings really shed light on how to design interventions to address the responsive caregiving component of nurturing care in addition to the nutrition component to improve dietary intake and child development. The study really helps advance the field of global nutrition by encouraging us to consider the importance of other family members aside from mothers and not placing all of the responsibility for child nutrition and development on mothers. Many in the nutrition field are starting to think more about engaging other family members, but that is really context specific and still gaining momentum in practice. So we're learning that integrating nutrition interventions with parenting and stimulation interventions can be effective. In nutrition, we often do not think as much about stimulation. One area that is gaining momentum in the field of global nutrition is responsive feeding, which is one way to link the nutrition and responsive caregiving components of the nurturing care framework. And these results can motivate the field of global nutrition to continue to expand responsive feeding interventions by engaging both parents in nutrition and stimulation. I will also add that it is interesting that there were not impacts on child growth, which actually is not surprising because of the short time period of the research. And therefore, as we actually outlined in a recent USAID report, this study really highlights the importance of looking at nutrition outcomes aside from growth, like dietary indicators, especially with shorter term interventions. And then last, I will say that I think these findings also add to the evidence base that really grew from the seminal Jamaica trial that some of you may be familiar with, in which we really started to learn how psychosocial stimulation and nutrition interventions can benefit from greater parental investment and yield long-term impacts, for instance, on education and earnings, as we saw with the recent 20-year follow-up research on that Jamaica and child nutrition and development program. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Erin. That was really insightful. Lynette, we'd like to hear from you as our ECD expert. This study showed promising results for improving child development outcomes and parenting behaviors, even though parenting was embedded within a broader nutrition and gender program. Should we be designing and delivering combined nutrition and parenting programs, or should we be designing and delivering these programs separately?
Thank you so much for this opportunity. The study has indeed shown that combined interventions are more effective than separate interventions. Considering that other studies have also come to this conclusion, and also that combining programs may also be more efficient and may help to increase access to services, it does make sense to deliver bundled interventions. This does seem to be the direction that evidence is pointing. The question, however, is how does this work in an environment where organizations, government ministries, and even funding is often specific to certain programs? What delivery mechanisms actually exist that can be used to ensure integrated programs in a systematic way? How can this be scaled up? I think the direction that research is pointing, I think people seem to generally agree is clear. But questions around readiness of systems, capacity and workload of the workforce, practicality in delivery, monitoring, etc., remain and need to be answered to ensure successful implementation, especially at scale. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynette. Those were excellent points. Clara, as our expert in engaging men and boys for gender equality, why are gender transformative interventions critical for addressing the different dimensions of the nurturing care framework? Health, nutrition, responsive caregiving, early learning, and security and safety.
Thank you, Carrie. And besides the very compelling results of this study, I would like to first mention, for those who may be wondering what a gender transformative intervention is, that in this context, we are referring to parenting interventions that challenge traditional and restrictive gender norms and practices regarding women and men's roles in the family, as a couple and as parents, and invites them to critically reflect how these restrictive gender norms can affect the quality of their relationships, the quality of home environment, children's upbringing, and even access to the resources such as food, healthcare, and other key decisions linked to well-being of mothers and children, and ultimately affect development and nutrition outcomes. So addressing social norms is at the heart of gender transformative programming, and parenting interventions that with these approaches engage men or male caregivers in ways that promote their active involvement as caring, equitable, nurturing, and nonviolent fathers, supporting of their female partners' decision-making in all spheres of life, taking up caregiving and domestic responsibilities, such as showed by the study results it actually managed to do. And gender transformative parenting programs therefore encourage fathers and couples to embrace behaviors that may depart from the gender roles they were taught, and also that typical health and parenting support programs generally don't question. These programs engage men and women, parents and partners, family members, and community in questioning these restrictive gender norms and affirming new values, skills, and attitudes centering on nurturing care, safety, and nonviolence, as well as mutual responsibility for children's family and well-being in all its dimensions, not associating specific domains along the sexual division of labor or traditional gender roles. And over the last decades, we've been learning from a growing body of evidence that has improved our understanding of the ways fathers can positively impact the health and well-being of children, their mothers, and themselves when they engage in this way. They can distinctly contribute to children's growth and development, as this study shows. And we know ultimately that the quality of home environment and the quality of relationships of the main adults in children's life critically influences their development. This is why another super important aspect of what gender transformative parenting programs can do for children's development is that they influence the way in which children learn from adults around them how to relate to others, what are acceptable ways to resolve conflicts, support and respect each other, and they learn about gender norms. This is how they are expected to behave based on their sex. So to finish why it's important, engaging men and women in gender transformative parenting programs and bundled with nutrition preferably can also help parents teach equitable, caring, and non-violent ways of relating with others that children will carry into their own relationships as peers, partners, and parents as they grow into adults. So also intergenerational effects beyond child development and nutrition.
Thank you so much, Cara, for those insightful comments. Erin, let's return to you. What can USAID or other partners who design and implement nutrition programs do related to engaging fathers and bundling parent interventions? What additional research or advocacy is needed to help with these efforts?
Great, thanks. So USAID is actually doing some work related to engaging other family members, including fathers, in nutrition programming and linking the nutrition and responsive caregiving and early learning components of the Nurturing Care Framework. For instance, through our flagship multi-sectoral nutrition program, USAID Advancing Nutrition, in partnership with UNICEF, we created a responsive care and early learning addendum to the globally used infant and young child feeding, or IYCF, counseling cards, including images of fathers. Again, in partnership with UNICEF, we also added images of fathers to the IYCF image bank for such counseling cards and broader social and behavior change initiatives. We also recently developed program guidance for nutrition practitioners on engaging family members to support mothers and other primary caregivers for improved nutrition outcomes. And then we at USAID also additionally recently established the FINE, or FINE, which stands for Family Inclusion in Nutrition Through Engagement, Community of Practice, to facilitate further dialogue, learning, and resource sharing among those who support or have interest in engaging family members in nutrition programs. So while we have done some work in this space, there is room to expand and integrate, for instance, parenting interventions more focused on stimulation and responsive caregiving into the standard nutrition programs. So then in terms of the question about additional research, while there is a growing evidence base, many of these topics are very context specific, and therefore research in different cultures and geographies can be useful to inform tailored intervention practices. Related research on the level of intensity or sort of dose of interventions and resources in addition to sustainability will be valuable. For example, when implementing integrated interventions, intervention packages can get truncated to accommodate other sectors or other material. And in this effects trial in Tanzania, the nutrition arms were more intense and had a higher dose of nutrition content compared to the nutrition content in the parenting arms. And so this raises the question about whether there is a sort of minimum package in terms of information, intensity, and again, sort of dose that is needed to achieve specific results, and over what time period such a package would need to be implemented for sustained results. So overall, there are different modalities in terms of quantity and quality that can be further explored for efficient use of resources for optimal impact on nutrition and child development. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Erin. We still have a lot to do, a lot more to understand. Lynette, I have another question for you. What implications does this study have for the Nurturing Care Framework? And what can the global ECD community do to ensure that parenting, nutrition, couples relationships, and gender equality are all addressed in ECD programming?
Thank you. Thanks again. So there's a lot of issues this study highlighted. I'll mention just three that perhaps would be useful to the global ECD community. First, there are aspects that are often not so visible in early childhood programs, such as couples relationships, gender equality, that certainly need to be included. So greater advocacy on the importance, and then also inclusion of some of the key messages in the communication strategies, in policies, in programs, as well as including these messages in ongoing generation and knowledge exchange activities. So the need for global goods, including guidelines, toolkits, etc., to support these efforts. Secondly, there's definitely a need to strengthen the capacity of workforce. I mean, you can't have 5 different groups of people visiting families. So strengthening the capacity of the home visitor so that they sort of are able to respond to these different issues. And not just the home visitor, but also the supervisors, the mentors, just deepening their knowledge and skills in supporting couples' relationships and all these other parenting issues, so that these don't stand out as standalone initiatives, but that are built into ongoing initiatives that strengthen existing practices. Thirdly, there's need to support the strengthening of systems to ensure delivery of combined intervention at scale. It might be that better coordination is what is required with a strong referral system so that all components are available and accessible, or that there is a strong coordination right from start, from design stage to implementation, including common language and measurement. So there's a lot that can be done that continues to remain a challenge, and many more studies needed to fill the gaps. But I must say that this study has provided the much needed evidence from the region that can help in design of programs. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynette, for those critically important insights. So now, Clara, for our final and very critical question, what elements of our intervention packages are unique compared to more standard parenting and nutrition curricula? In other words, what makes our packages gender responsive or gender transformative? You addressed this a little bit earlier, but maybe you could provide more insight.
Yeah, thank you. So unpacking what I was saying above, the first obvious element is that unlike most parenting programs, Effects, your program, made an intentional decision to engage fathers. And this doesn't mean just inviting them to join a new gender-neutral parenting program. We know that wouldn't work. It requires starting from formative research and a keen interest in understanding fathers or male caregivers' concerns around parenting, learning about their own ideas and practices regarding fatherhood in the specific communities in the Mara region where the intervention was to be implemented. You adapted evidence-based fatherhood program methodologies to address the specific nutrition, development, and couple dynamics in these communities. And in terms of the specific intervention approach, what this means is that the content you adapted that draws on, let's say, sociological theories of gender and masculinities and highlights how these gender inequalities are reproduced and transformed through everyday interactions in the home, by parents, with children. And from this conceptual framework and using evidence-based educational content, you included very engaging, participatory, and experiential methodologies in the curriculum that included discussion among peers, storytelling, not just teaching what parents should be doing better, but engaging them from and building from their experiences in critical reflection around how these restrictive gender norms were affecting or could affect their parenting, nutrition, and caregiving. Third, the program helped build this joint critical skills related to couple communication that Lynette was just mentioning, and understanding each other, sharing of domestic work, and nonviolent conflict resolution, as well as improving nutrition and child stimulation, which is, let's say, the regular content, but this to both mothers and fathers. So, of course, the effect is stronger. And this was what had, I think, most impact in shifting both the gender attitudes and the behaviors. Male engagement interventions, which is part of gender transformative approaches, have evolved then from seeking to involve men to overcome specific barriers, so more as instruments that have to do with women's limited decision-making power or access to healthcare. And interventions such as Effect are now increasingly becoming gender transformative and engaging men and their partners to challenge the inequitable gender and power dynamics that give rise to such barriers. So this is what makes it gender transformative.
Thank you so much, Cara. And I really want to thank all of you, Erin, Lynette, and Cara, for participating in our panel and for sharing your valuable perspectives on the broader implications of this study for nutrition, ECD, and gender practice and research. It's really clear that a lot more work is needed to optimize the design and implementation of multi-input programs that holistically address the needs of young children and their families. But it's also clear that we've learned a lot through the effects study. So now I want to pass it over to Mary Pat, who will facilitate a Q&A session for the remainder of our event. Over to you, Mary Pat.
Thanks, Carrie, and thanks also to the panelists. We've been getting some interesting questions in the chat box, and I'm going to do my best here to talk us through them. I'd like to bring Elfrida Kumalija on the stage, please, to answer the first question from Dr. Dennis Tindiebwa. Dennis asks, what challenges were met in having both parents participating in the study equally well? And Elfrida, I think you're best to place that, to answer that. Elfrida?
Hello.
Okay, there you are. Okay, can you answer Dennis's questions about the challenges of having both parents and what you found during the intervention time?
There weren't like, I wouldn't call them like really challenges. There were some issues related to, firstly, the fathers attending the sessions, because it wasn't something that the community initially viewed as something that the fathers could do, like nutrition or early childhood development or nurturing care was something new, like to the community, especially for fathers to be engaged. So that was something that brought some difficulties in the initial process of the intervention. But also with the joint sessions that we had, there were some issues with the conversations, the dynamics between fathers and mothers, and agreeing upon some of the issues like budgeting for household incomes, according to gender norms in Mara region, where we implemented like fathers were the final decision makers. So changing that, it was sometimes a heated discussion, which brought some back and forth during the intervention implementation. But they weren't like really big challenges, but involving fathers and mothers together, the intervention, yeah.
Let me ask a follow-on question to that while we have you, Elfrida. And the question is about how the CHWs were prepared to facilitate these discussions, or how the groups managed them. Can you talk a little bit about what support the CHWs needed for this?
Yeah, so in the beginning, we actually started with a very comprehensive training to the CHWs on the skills to facilitate these peer group discussions. And actually from the training, we started by training the CHWs on how to build on the knowledge the community has, and acknowledging the gender norms and roles in the community, but as well as trying to incorporate the new information from what the people believe, and trying to make try to provide the information so that they can understand the importance of actually doing the practices that were taught in the peer groups. But also we had the supervision structure where field supervisors were providing mentorship, very close mentorship to the CHWs on actually attending the group sessions and providing feedback to the CHWs so that they can continue facilitating the peer group sessions in a quality way. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Elfrida. And I also want to commend the work you did with your team on making this possible. There were several questions in the comments about the issues of scaling up. And I'd like Lauren to maybe speak to a few of those issues and your thoughts on where to go next with this work.
Thanks, Mary Pat. Yeah, that's an important question, and certainly one that colleagues at the government of Tanzania have been asking us when we did some dissemination events back in December last year. This study was a research study, obviously, so it wasn't necessarily designed for scale, but we were very intentional about working through existing systems and structures so that the intervention could be scaled. However, a lot more work would be needed in terms of certainly addressing CHW workload, their scopes of work. A lot of the costs came from, we did provide CHW stipends for their time supporting the intervention or delivering the intervention. Printing of materials was quite costly. So those types of things would be, I think, challenging for the government to scale. But certainly the bundling, we didn't do any major cost effectiveness study. We did some back of the envelope calculations. We found that the difference between nutrition only and bundling, there was very small differences from a cost perspective. However, engaging fathers is more costly than, or engaging couples is more costly than engaging mothers only, because we had father groups, so we had more CHWs in those working in those study arms, and that comes with additional costs. However, we do believe the benefits of the study do outweigh those additional costs. So yeah, we would love to continue this work and try to bring it to a larger scale, and then maybe be more intentional about doing some cost effectiveness analyses there. But we're hoping to continue, and if we do so, I think we have enough evidence to really advocate for this kind of programming, and yeah, at a larger scale. But a lot more work would be needed, and our intervention packages also need to be refined. There's a lot more work that would need to be done there in terms of the, really optimizing the bundling, so that we have enough attention in those packages to the parenting content.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. That was great. Nalupa, Judy Kanawati had a question on the anthropometry results and wonders why we didn't see more effects on child growth.
Great, thank you for that. Yeah, I think there was a question about exactly what happened with the anthropometry results. I know it's a lot of data to take in, and whether there was no effective intervention or the interventions having more or less equal effect. And the answer is that that basically the interventions did not have an effect on anthro. You see, for example, in the length for age, you would see a small reduction across all arms, and that was the benefit of having the control arm, in addition to kind of the factorial design that we had for our two interventions, is to be able to make that that comparison. So while we did see a pretty sizable effect in terms of dietary diversity for children, that didn't translate into linear growth, and that is something one would, or linear growth, or just anthropometry in general, anthropometric outcomes in general. And while that would be ideal, we all know that anthropometry is affected by a lot of other factors as well beyond just diets, and that would likely explain that disconnect.
Okay, can you talk a little bit also, just to add on, about the length of the intervention and how long do you think it takes to really be able to affect child growth in a program like this?
Right. I mean, our intervention, and part of it was due to the disruption caused by COVID. Between baseline and endline, we had nearly 2 years. Children at the beginning were below 18 months, but then aged considerably. Even so, at baseline, we had some degree of growth faltering already. in that population. So that continued a little bit as we continued on. But the intervention, it was originally intended to be a 12-month program, but because of COVID, it was extended.